Okay, I guess it's a good time to get started. So thank you all for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about a specific type of cyber risk associated with vendor access management. And we have two speakers today. We have myself, and I'll let my co-speaker introduce himself.
Yeah, my name is Kush Sharma. I work with MISA Ontario as their Director of Municipal Modernization and Partnerships. I am also the former CISO for the City of Toronto and have worked in public service for numerous years.
All right, I'm looking forward to the conversation today. My name is Don Bowman. I'm the founder and CEO here at Agillicus and have a long and storied history of cloud and security and networking spanning multiple companies across Canada, and very excited to be for this conversation today. So the 2-second pitch on Agillicus before we get started on the topic. We've been a MISA member since the start, which is partly why Kush is here helping us today. And we're all about simple and secure access. We're Ontario-based. We're located in the region of Waterloo, and we're a MISA national partner. And today we're working with partners serving over 170 municipalities. And we're all about a low-cost managed zero-trust platform. And you've probably heard about zero-trust in a lot of different ways. We're not going to go into a lot of technical detail on that today. But the key is that this scales to all levels of government. We announced earlier this year our deployment with the Government of Canada, and we've announced also with other municipalities at different scale. So it's not just a solution that you have to be a certain size. There's no right size for anybody here. So before we get started, first we're going to do a poll. I think everybody sees the poll. This is just to wake up the crowd. The question is, I have third parties or contractors or vendors who access my systems. And you get to choose and see what you think. And this is anonymous. We're just going to see just a quick poll of the crowd. All right, it looks like most of the people have joined today because they believe that that is a true statement. It's interesting because I've presented this in the past and found that people didn't necessarily agree with that. So it was an interesting thing there that you guys have said that you do. So let's get started. So first is, how do I define a third party or vendor? So different people, different opinions on this. I think in terms of identity systems. So each of your organizations has an investment in identity. You might call it different things. You might call it single sign-on, you might call it Active Directory, you might call it email, but ultimately you have an idea of this person, first name, last name, social insurance number, face. They work for me in some way, shape, or form. And then you have an idea of people who work with me, but not for me. And those could be contractors, temps, students in the park in the summer as volunteers. They could be vendors who make software for you. They could be people who run systems for you. It could be the lights in the arena. It could be the water treatment systems. It could be somebody who helps you in an ad hoc fashion. Hey, we're upgrading our ERP system and somebody's going to work with us for 2 months to do. It could be somebody who's with you forever as an MSP. But the key is that they all have their own identity systems. And there's this blurry line between I work with company A and company A has given me person B to work with. And you often think in terms of a username and password and identity. And if that username and password is shared into that company, then you can get into a situation where as that person changes, you're not really changing that access. These people have a legitimate need to access the system. So the question today is, how do we do that in a cyber secure fashion that is also still convenient for all parties involved? So today we're going to go through a set of discussions between us here. And I guess my first question I'll pose is, what are the biggest cyber security risks third parties and vendors pose to municipalities? So any input on that?
From my perspective, I think municipalities have to really look at privileged access management. So there is, security, IT, other administrations in the OT side of the house that requires some management and administration. which many of the smaller municipalities don't have the capability to do at this point in time due to technology or funding or skill set issues. We also have to look at vendor access and breaking off that link if there is a zero-day attack. So how can we enable municipalities to quickly turn the tap off, so to speak, right? If there is a zero-day from a vendor. And then, we look at things like protecting private information, PII, health data, or other sensitive data, right? IP addresses, our network architectures, new programs that are coming in play, information about children's services, etc. So these are some of the aspects that we need to look at as municipalities and are kind of top of mind.
So you mentioned turning the tap off and OT. By OT, I presume you mean operational technology or industrial control systems, SCADA, the things that go bump in the night. Is there anything specific to that area that you would highlight for these third-party intersection with municipality risks?
Yeah, I think with many of the SCADA systems or operational technologies that are not traditional IT, there is many of them are air gapped, many of them are still not connected to the internet, and some of the newer technologies are actually connecting these systems for a point in time through the internet, and so this is a new aspect that we have to look at that traditionally that we didn't look at. And now you have a vulnerability because you're opening up that access for these specific, very sensitive systems to either send data, get data, etc., through the internet. And that specific time frame when that happens needs to be highly regulated and controlled, and it should be temporary. And so, when we look at third-party risks, many municipalities don't have the capability to do it themselves, so it's kind of outsourced. And then those folks are going to be doing the administration, that high-level privileged access administration for them. So this is an area that we need to keep in mind as a critical function going forward.
Yeah, so I guess just to close off this question, I mean, first problem is that shared credentials. How do I allow that person in at that time for that limited task when I might be working more broadly? The second is that data breach and leak. You talked about PII and children and internal telemetry. And none of your vendors would purposely leak that, but it increases the risk surface for sure. And then I guess the third that OT systems struggle a lot with is lateral traversal. A lot of those things are very difficult to firewall because they're not really IP and they're bolted to a wall and they last for 20 years. And if I give you access to one, I have to give you access to all, and that privileged access management can be challenging. I guess the second question I would pose is, what's the universe of things that need third-party vendor access to? Like, what's the sort of genre of stuff we're talking about here?
So there's obviously the operational technology. So the water systems, the transportation systems, the rail systems, solid waste, etc., fire, police. Then there's if we look at the network perspective, is the file folder, the shared drive, the traditional stuff. There's custom applications, there's business applications. And so, many of your services for citizens will likely run on some of these custom apps or the business apps that you've procured. And so those are sensitive, and we need to look at that from a third-party perspective. And then traditional, again, network, host, web servers, email systems, etc. The other kind of aspect we have to look at in today's world is the command and control access. So, root access, domain level access, or in the cybersecurity world, we're looking at full-blown admin access, command and control through the cybersecurity technologies. And so we need to make sure that specific, if you're outsourcing, if you have a third party, managing your cybersecurity, that they have specific limited access to the security technologies which give command and control. Which is basically, kind of like full access to everything. And that's on the back end. So we need to protect that and take a look at that aspect also.
Yeah, so it's a big spectrum. I mean, talking about a share, that could be as simple as, hey, I'm doing this new marketing launch of something and I'm working with an outsourced firm to do the graphics. onwards through the financial records and SIN number of everybody that lives here. And obviously ransomware and shares and Microsoft SMB have a symbiotic relationship. The other end of that spectrum, you're talking about like a managed offering where somebody's managing your SOC, your SIM, your XDR, and therefore they are you. Obviously that the further down that spectrum you get, I think the bigger the envelope of what you need to worry about is. Is there any low-hanging fruit you could suggest for somebody that's, a good bang for the buck in terms of if you do this, your risk goes down a lot for the cost?
I think if you could control third-party access, so vendor access, so whether they're independent contractors doing your IT administration or security administration, so i.e. privileged access, and that includes and that traverses into the OT space. So administrators that are external that are helping you maintain or upgrade your water systems, transportation systems, fire systems, anything that is very critical and that could result in financial loss of data or life safety issues. Those are the technologies, aspects, data, business application systems that really should be looked at first if you have a limited budget, and then you could look at expanding it throughout the entire network. But those are the ones that should be focused on. Typically, those have limited administrators at any rate, so it's the cost of potentially putting a solution like this in could be done in phases. Don, does that answer?
Yeah. I guess for me, I think one of the things I propose to people is, let's leverage the investments we've made in identity and authentication, single sign-on. A lot of the organizations we work with, a lot of the municipalities have achieved great things through Office 365 and multi-factor and so on, but they've only done it with their first-party users. And we think there's a good opportunity to leverage that. It's a person with an audit trail that did this instead of it's a company with a password that might have done this. That really helps on tightening up, lowering the privilege, lowering the time, understanding who's done what, and if there's something goes wrong, limiting the blast radius and making the audit simpler. You mentioned financial downside. Obviously, cybersecurity insurance has become increasingly hard to get. So I think a lot of the people we deal with are increasingly focused on controlling the underlying risk. What do you see as the main challenges? When you're talking about third-party access, what do people say, that's the hard bit? What's the hard bit?
So from my experience and in speaking with some of my colleagues in the municipalities, decentralized administration is an issue because many municipalities are not, either they're a centralized municipality or a county with multiple municipalities under them, or it's a larger city that has multiple IT departments. So in my former life, there's about 13 IT departments, and so it's very complex to manage third-party access. So we have to look at automation and look at external solutions such as this one to streamline that, right, and to centralize it to some respect, and then that, as you mentioned, Don, provides an additional level of control. The other aspect is many municipalities are, let's be honest, not as mature as some of the bigger ones, and they're trying, but they have limited resources and funding, and so that buying multiple technologies, right, is not feasible. So looking at solutions that could bring together different aspects of controlling your, posture and environment from a cybersecurity perspective is something that, should be looked at and is kind of low-hanging fruit. And then the skill set gap. So when you have a technology that is, easy to maintain, good user interface, multiple technologies built into one, then, the administration cost and the number of skilled resources you need to manage that substantially decreases.
Yeah, I guess so. You mentioned breadth. Some municipalities have multiple IT teams. One related item that I've run into is sometimes the municipality runs some systems of IT on behalf of a related organization. It could be a library, it could be a community center, it could be supportive housing, it could be an arts center. And sometimes there's also the double-hatted people. They work with, you know, a two-tier government, or the region and the municipality both. We've also seen cases where a larger nearby municipality may support a smaller one for very specific skill sets. For example, water management, you know, the license and so on is complicated to do. I guess, you know, the breadth of tools is the other one you highlighted. There's a lot of very pointed tools in the market, and each is perfect for its need, but collectively they're too expensive to manage versus, you know, the one-size-fits-all is, you know, there's no right answer for everybody. I guess the ones that I see, you know, you mentioned, you know, the different teams and so on. That turnover, those shared credentials, we see that as a big challenge to solve by bringing into the central identity. Every company, when a staffer leaves, they terminate them from their identity system. You know, if you trust the identity system rather than the password, it's easier. The other one we've seen is the multi-factor. People find that challenging. I work with company A to support me, but that mean I have one multi-factor for the whole company, but they have multiple people? Does that mean they need to share it? Well, the answer is no. But they go down this path of, well, there's one YubiKey and it's on a hook and I go in and grab it, or some of them do something terrible, like they call a friend to get the second factor to type it in. There's some challenges there. What do you think the best thing is to minimize that risk? What's the area? I mean, risk driving it to zero could be infinitely expensive, but for the resources available, what should you do?
Yeah, so there's different aspects. There's the technology aspect, which we'll get into. From a business perspective, municipalities really have to work with their legal departments and procurement to build in some sort of standard verbiage into all contracts. And so that shouldn't be like a big task, but there is some initial effort to work with those two other teams to draft something. And then that should be kind of the standard. And that'll help right from the get-go. So you're not, you know, monitoring, auditing them at the back end with the technology, but you're actually putting in the front end controls. And, you know, then you could have a system or technology or security policies set up so that could be, you know, monitored and complied to. And then what we have to do is also very simple stuff, right? Is you should think about working with procurement to actually build a vendor list. So you can't protect something that you don't know that's existing. And so one of the exercises that should be done, which could be quickly done, right? Because a lot of these things are either in the tool, existing asset management, or some sort of procurement tool, or if not, you know, it's, you know, some of these are in spreadsheets, what have you. You have to consolidate it. And then you kind of know, here's my vendor landscape, right? I have these many vendors, and here's the top, you know, 10, 15 vendors. And these are the ones I'm going to focus on initially, because these top 10 or 15 vendors are doing 80% of my business, i.e., you know, these contractors are managing X on behalf of my municipality. And you can start there, very simple stuff. Automation is key. So Don's going to talk a little bit about the technology in a second, but automating some of these tasks, once you know what the key vendors are, is critical. And, you know, municipalities need, you know, a solution that is cost effective. You know, in the market, we see new players coming in this specific arena all the time, but it's quite expensive. And so we need to look at automating as many steps as possible. And then slowly, step by step, you know, you take the business action first, then you look at a technology to streamline and automate. And third is really you start building out your program, right? So step by step, you build your third-party access management program out. And so that's kind of the order for most municipalities, which are smaller or medium sized, right? You could really hit it hard in the beginning with a little bit of work with the controls. Then you look at a technology solution that's cost effective. And then third, you could start thinking about your overall approach for the next 2-3 years and how you're going to increase and improve your third-party risk management program.
So you mentioned a couple of teams within the organization. You mentioned legal and you mentioned procurement. If we look to other jurisdictions, this is an area that the United States has made some investments in particular for procurement. They have this thing called TIPS, which has sort of standardized contract terms and contracting. And also they've done some work through CISA on automating security assertions and risk modeling. Is there anything that you see coming in, this is a predominantly Canadian audience today, coming here that could assist, standing on the backs of giants or implementing best practices without necessarily re-implementing the world in that area for Canada?
Yeah, it's a little more challenging. I don't think we're there yet like the U.S. The U.S. has made, the federal government in the U.S. has made, multi-millions and close to billions of dollars worth of investment with the new legislation coming in, specifically for cybersecurity, and they've dedicated funding directly for local government, as they call it. And so the landscape and the environment is a little bit different there. They are ahead of Canadian municipalities, and I think we're working as NISA Ontario to bolster those relationships with the province and the federal government to help and provide more support directly to municipalities like the U.S. governments are. And so I think until we get there, we have to play catch up, to be honest. Now there are, the larger municipalities obviously have more funding, have more resources that are dedicated to security. So they have, many of them have technologies, tools, and templates, standardized ways of doing things in terms of risk management. And so one of the things that we can do going forward is work together with them to leverage some of those standard templates and verbiage in the contracts. And so that's something that we could look at as a community going forward.
Yeah, and I think obviously MISA could play a big role in that as well for their best practices. So I guess the area I come at it from a very technology-centric area, obviously, and I think in terms of precise user resource segmentation that minimizes risk. It's this vendor needs to do X. If I can keep them around X, I don't have to worry as much. And that fine-grained authorization, well, this user is allowed to be root during these hours, during this maintenance window, and multi-factor. I'm a huge fan of multi-factor. I mean, it's not, you curse a little bit when you're asked for the code that one time, but it saves your bacon on a periodic basis. So I think it's one of the low-hanging fruit, in my opinion. And I'm a big fan of trust but verify with the whole Reagan thing with detailed auditing. If you know who did what as opposed to who might have done what, it's just so huge weight off your shoulders. If I switch gears a little bit from the Q&A, I'm going to show you a little bit about what I feel is a really strong tool in a toolbox. So it would be naive to say one tool fixes all. There's a lot of cybersecurity layers and defense in depth, but I think that really this concept of zero trust, it's that nexus of identity, authorization, and access. If I know who you are and what you're allowed to do and how I get you there, and I do that in the most fine-grained fashion possible for each of the steps. Who is not a company, who is a person? What is not a network? What is that web server, that share, that file? If I get that as narrow as possible, that's what zero trust is all about. It's about the idea of not VPNing to a network and therefore having implicit privilege. It's about explicit. And you'll see zero trust come up a lot. This term came on the scene, it came on the scene about a decade ago, but really in 2019, the United States National Institute of Standards Technology standardized it. It became a strategy for their levels of government. It's ratified here in Canada. You'll see that as well. And you'll see a lot of different solutions around it. And they all come back to this who, what, how. Who is the user? What are they allowed to do? And how is the how they get there to that protected thing. My solution, which I think is pretty good, today we've deployed this in a number of different critical infrastructure areas. So water treatment is a great example, but also just other things like timesheets, payrolls, parking tickets. You know, each of those things, they're not kept in a private data center behind a microsegmented firewall. They're used from people on the street. So it really comes down to, we think about the idea of federated identity. As a municipality, I guarantee some of the people you work with are not in your Active Directory. And that's not going to change. And I don't think it's the right thing to do to create vendor_A in your Office 365, because you're not in their HR system flow. If they leave their organization, you got to get notified, and you're chewing up license costs to do that. Instead, they should do single sign-on with their credentials, just like you do with yours. It's a great thing to protect against spear phishing. If your users see the same login experience all day, every day, then they know when something's gone wrong. Multi-factor needs to work. It needs to work as it does for their own native things. But then you need to control what. So you might be prepared to allow your partners to control the who. I work with company A, they're allowed to hire and fire person B, but I need to control the what. What is that company, what is that person allowed to do? I can't outsource that. And then the last is the how. Critical infrastructure is really interesting. A lot of our customers don't have public IP access to the facilities. And it might be because of remoteness. Maybe they use satellite or cellular connectivity, and it's got network address translation. But sometimes also, you mentioned the word air-gapped earlier, and it's kind of air-gapped. It's something that's an enclave in somewhere, and it may be prepared to allow outbound restricted access, but it isn't prepared to allow much in the way of inbound. And that's kind of what we think we've done that's kind of neat, is outbound only access, single port 443, single SSL session. You know, there's no inbound, you know, things to show up on that scanner. And as a consequence, we feel our implementation of Zero Trust is the right fit for a lot of different municipalities at all different sizes. You know, you can get started for one user at that partner that manages your water or your lights and the building management system, and move on upwards without too much work. I'm going to show you a 2-second demo, and then we'll switch back to the discussion here. So let me share my screen. All right. So imagine that your organization has water treatment, operational technology, industrial control system. You'll hear the word HMI a lot. HMI stands for human machine interface. It's a fancy thing that could be as simple as a web browser. It could be as complicated as something bolted to the wall. It could be as old as a thermostat. The thermostat we all entered, house as a kid from Honeywell, that was the round Lyric. Those are also HMIs. And so what I'm showing here, we call it profile. This is like a launch pad. You don't have to use it. In my model of Zero Trust, I think about each resource. It's as if it was on the public internet. It has its own URL, its own domain name, its own SSL certificate. There's no wildcards here. And its own sign-in. And what I've done is I've forced the use of multi-factor all the time, so we'll see that. But in this case, imagine that you work with a partner, and the partner manages your water treatment. They could be the system integrator that set it up, and they're tuning some PLCs and setting some parameters associated with motors. They could be the person that manages the chemicals. It could be the audit trail with the province. But the sign-in experience for all of them is absolutely the same. The first thing is, instead of having it going straight to your Azure login, there's a list of providers. So sign in with Microsoft. This is going to work with anyone who uses Microsoft. So if you click this and your partner uses Azure and they have their own domain, and this other partner uses Office 365, they'll both see their native sign-in flow. But then also some of your partners will use Google G Suite. And sometimes they're independent contractors and they can use their Gmail. The key is there's never a password. We use G Suite here, so I'll show that sign-in flow. And it's the same sign-in flow I see for every single application. It's not different because I'm dealing with the water treatment, except the authorization flow, I force the use of multi-factor. And here, I've got it set up to do push notifications to my phone, which should chirp, and it did. Sorry, getting the face right on it. And then click, and then click. So the radar on my phone recognized my face, my second factor's there. And now, back to that convenience topic, I'm in the magical water treatment plant, and I'm like, oh no, we need to change the temperature set point to this, and close that valve, and close this valve, and close this valve. Don't worry, it's not a real water treatment plant. Sometimes it's more basic than that. Sometimes it's a remote desktop experience. The vendor has a PC on the site, and it has their management software, and they need to access it. Remote desktop is otherwise complicated. This is what's driven a lot of organizations to use things like TeamViewer and have a shared account. There was a municipality in Florida a couple years ago that got into trouble for doing that. And it happens a lot, and this is sort of more shadow IT. It's somebody's done this because it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't the right thing to do, and nobody knows about it. But it's the same experience. You can actually, right in the browser, have that desktop. So this is a desktop experience. This works on a phone, a tablet, or whatever, but it was the same sign-in. I'm already signed in, but it was the same multi-factor. I control the who, I control the what they're allowed to do, even though they work for somebody else. Now I don't have to have local accounts created on this PC, which is what they were looking to solve with TeamViewer, but I've done it with a consistent audit trail, and it works with Microsoft RDP as well. And then back to that share. Shares, it's the bread and butter of a lot of things. You got files you need to share, and lots of ways you can do it. But when the rubber hits the road, somewhere there's a disk full of files. In OT, it might be the log files of the water treatment plant, and they're just there. It's called the historian. In marketing, it might be that new launch window. It could be your accountant and your auditor, or your PDF files. Being able to allow access in a fine-grained fashion to a share through any identity system without worrying about ransomware, we bring it all into this protocol called WebDAV, and we think that's a really strong thing there. But anyway, that idea is for who is anybody? What is what I control, what they're allowed to do, and how. Now, we're going to run the poll again here, but interestingly, most of you answered yes the first time, so I think probably we're going to get the same answers the second time. We'll see how that goes. And the last time I ran this, it was interesting. Some people changed their mind during it. I started off by saying, I have remote people who access my org, and a few people were like, not true. But then, interestingly, they changed their mind. So I guess there, just letting that poll come up for a bit, it looks like, I'll give it one more second. Yeah, we got 100% yes again. So, interesting. So I guess coming back to close this off, we had a bit of a discussion, you and I. You come at this from the standpoint of there's a process, and I build a plan, and I work with legal, and I work with procurement, and I normalize, and I build a list of my vendors. I understand the risk envelope I work within, and then these are my challenges. With your current role with MISA on modernization, I suspect that modernization should improve some of those challenges, but I suspect it also adds some additional ones. More and more vendors require access as part of the product, right? So I've seen that in the industrial space. It used to be the control system was a piece of electronics that didn't have radios in it, and now the control system is so complicated that only the vendor can manage it, and they require 24/7 remote access. Is there any other risks like that you would highlight that you could see Zero Trust might be a good answer for, if not the best answer?
Yeah, there's one actually coming up, which is probably the biggest risk, is the elections. So many municipalities will have elections coming up very shortly. And I've gone through one of the biggest elections when I was at the City of Toronto. We were, knock on wood, secure for that one. But this is going to be extremely challenging going forward. There's many actors targeting Canadian governments at all levels, especially during election periods. And what happens during elections, you have many different types of customized applications. You have off-the-shelf applications that are tweaked. You have tabulators specifically that need to be protected. You have machines which are tabulating the votes, right, in various locations. You have secure locations that need to be protected with various equipments that are in them and the transport thereof. So there's a lot of technology involved, even on the back end, right? Even if it's not online voting, when it comes to elections. And there's many, elections are a very, very large task, and it's a heavy task to execute. It requires dedicated people, and you have a lot of people coming in to help with the elections, right? Across the board, whether it's technology or people just, at the centers, right, taking and giving advice and, double checking, validating names in the computer database, etc. And so you have this massive influx of temporary people that come in for a few weeks, specifically, the last 2 or 3 days to the election, and then boom, you got to offload all of them. So from an access perspective, it's extremely challenging. You have to do, you have to have, a full team of technology and cybersecurity folks, 24 hours for a given amount of time, and then ramp everyone in, ramp everyone out. And so this is a use case that needs to be looked at, and it's a big challenge for many municipalities, not only smaller ones but larger ones also.
It's interesting, like 5 years ago, the topic of cyber risk and elections was the most boring thing on planet Earth, and nobody thought there was any chance of anything happening. And suddenly the world changed, right? So, you got state-sponsored actors, and you've got party A versus B, and you've got conspiracy theories, and holy crap. And then suddenly, even the election workers themselves suddenly became risk factors. One of the things, I guess, with elections that I've seen, a lot of municipalities bring up fairly temporary websites associated with the election. I'm assuming that those are probably constructed for them partially by these third parties there, and I'm assuming that they often have some access to the municipal resources to do it. Is that something that you've seen, or you see that changing, or?
So it depends on the municipalities, but and it also depends on the funding, the timeline that council's given municipalities to set everything up. But it's more complicated, so it's many times easier to outsource it because it's a temporary budget. It's usually a separate allocated budget
Yeah.
to the clerk's office as opposed to corporate IT. And so there's usually a little bit more funding than traditional IT when it comes to elections, because we want to make sure elections are secure. We want to make sure that democracy prevails. And outside of the misinformation campaigns that are going on in Canada, the second kind of aspect that we have to look at is third party risk, because we have so many third parties, whether they're outside technology or cybersecurity type vendors coming in to help and support. Many of these machines, like the tabulators, right? You need a dedicated specialized person from the vendor. It's their machine, their software, right? They have the security protocols around that. And so it's not like you could train someone up in 2 days or 3 days or a week or a month to run and understand those machines. And so, unless you've purchased them, which is a different story, but typically you could rent those. And then, we have to look at all these specific areas of risk, including third party. And the zero trust model is kind of the de facto model going forward for cybersecurity professionals.
Okay. And just circling back a little bit to the operational technology, the industrial control systems, this has been a passion of mine for a while. It's not a very sexy space. People tend to think about cybersecurity equals ransomware desktop or cloud server, but people are buying computers and attaching them to infrastructure and expecting them to live for 20 years. And not only, there's no patches for them, they can't be patched. There's not even security researchers usually. There's no CVEs, common vulnerabilities. The federal government has put forward a new bill, C-26, and in it they're talking about cybersecurity on certain aspects of critical infrastructure around interprovincial transportation and pipelines and things like that. It doesn't really cover this type of critical infrastructure. And you mentioned, the big investments that the United States has made in this area. Is there anything specific in the area or general in the area of operational technology? We're clearly on a path that it's going to become more IT focused. It's on a collision course with IT. It's going to become more mainstream. It's a Windows PC that's the HMI. Even though you can't update it for 20 years, it's going to be there. more people are going to need access. The vendor is going to require it as part of doing the business. The underlying stuff is more complex. The training is harder. Anything that you can see coming there that's going to be more systematic to help, or?
I think zero trust solutions are one, because those are key critical systems for public safety, and they have to be protected. And so there has to be an investment made for those third parties to have limited access, temporary access, or if they have kind of 24/7 permanent access as they're the administrators, then there needs to be a very strong audit log. But in addition to that, we see in the marketplace technologies coming that are not only doing this type of work, but are actually can detect and respond to in real time for let's say sensor type systems. So kinetic systems that are physical and logical in nature, SCADA systems, engineering systems, building systems, and then physical devices. And so they don't run traditionally like IT. You can't just hook up specific existing security tools to them. They might cause some operational disruption. So their architecture is built in a different way. They read the electrical signals, or they read the sensors instead, and they're more passive than active. But these newer technologies combined with zero trust philosophies, I see are coming together in the near future. And the combination of them are going to help you protect your operational technology infrastructure in a far superior way than what we had before, right? Which was more manual controls and traditional IT controls, kind of overlaid on OT, and many times kind of doesn't fit. But we're seeing that entire industry change for the better.
Just on that, so you mentioned distributed teams earlier, and this is an area that we see huge distribution where it's very common that the water team and the corporate IT team each have similar underlying responsibilities but parallel. Do you see any merger or anything in there where the roles might change around a little bit so that some things become more central or less central across the control systems?
So the perspective would be like traditional IT corporate infrastructures and technologies like Windows or Office 365 may become more centralized, right? Because for cost efficiency across multiple different units. But if you look at traditional, like the water system, right? There's specific regulations around how to maintain and run a water plant, and that includes the technology, the skill set of the people, and the responsibility and accountability for that those people have that traditional IT folks don't have in the municipality, right? So I won't get into the particulars, but I think there's still going to be a segregation there because there's regulation and mandates for it, and there's specific skill sets and specific complications in that environment that you need a specialized skill set to run it. Now, are there commonalities? Yes, there's commonalities on the corporate side, right? So traditional ITs, like, if they're using AD and we're using AD, if they're using 365, we're using 0365. If they're using SAP, we're using SAP, right, to run finance or something. So those are the commonalities that could likely be centralized, if possible, right, if it's feasible to do. But I still see some value in the segregation of the critical systems of water, transportation, solid waste, police.
Yeah, I guess that totally makes sense. So I guess with that, if there's any questions from the crowd, you can feel free to type them in the chat. See if you can stump one of us as you see fit. But otherwise, I thank everyone very much for your time today. Thank you very much, Kush, for your time, your guidance. It really helps. Like I said, companies like ourselves that are focusing on the municipal market, it really is important to hear from each person. Webinars like this are how I reflect that back to the audience, but you each have your own internal strengths, weaknesses, priorities, depriorities. After this, I hope that some of you will take a bit of a follow-up from my team. I think Bridge has posted that in the chat there, but you may be hearing from John Chipetta or Brian Parr. You may have seen them through a number of different MISA events and so on over the last couple of years. And they'd love to chat with you individually and see if there's a way that you can help the education process come backwards towards us, or that we can maybe assist in something that is a little bit simpler, make it a little bit simpler than we otherwise could. Okay, it doesn't seem like we have any inbound questions, so thank you very much, my co-presenter. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you very much to the audience. I really, really appreciate your time out of your day.